We're very pleased to be here today with Dr. Valter Longo. Now, Dr. Longo is a professor of gerontology and biological sciences, and he's the director of the Longevity Institute at USC in Los Angeles. He's also the author of the Longevity Diet, the much anticipated English version of the Italian bestseller. And this book was just released last month. Dr. Longo's studies focus on the fundamental mechanisms of aging in simple organisms and in mice and in humans. The Longo laboratory at USC has identified several genetic pathways that regulate aging in simple organisms and reduce the incidence of multiple diseases in both mice and in humans. His laboratory also described both dietary and genetic interventions that can reverse the course of diabetes and Alzheimer's disease and protect cells and improve the treatment of cancer and other diseases in mammals. Dr. Longo is recognized as a global leader in aging and nutrition, has more than 106 peer-reviewed publications in journals like Science, Nature, Cell, JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association, Circulation, Cancer Cell, the Journal of Translational Medicine, etc. In other words, he is a research all-star. He's been recognized by Time magazine with 3 features in less than 2 years, which is a very big deal. And he is considered the longevity guru. He's one of the most featured scientists by global media and news feeds. So thank you so much for being here with us today, Dr. Longo.
Thank you.
So let's get, you got a lot of information to share. So we got a lot of awesome questions for you today. Let's start at the top here. In 2014, you wrote a paper in which you analyzed the mortality of more than 6,000 people following either a low protein, a medium protein, or a high protein diet, and found that people who ate medium and high protein actually experienced more diabetes mortality. Can you explain a little bit about that paper and give our listeners some insight into what is the association between dietary protein and diabetes mortality?
Yeah, so in that study, we looked at the CDC database called NHANES, and basically we had available 6,000 people that were followed by the CDC for close to 20 years. And then disease incidence was, and mortality was monitored. And basically, the main focus was on overall mortality, so all-cause mortality, and secondary was cancer. And then we also talked about diabetes. And this was between people that had more than 20% of the calories coming from proteins, between 10 and 20%, and less than 10%. And the finding was that people that in the US that consumed less than 10% of the proteins, of the calories coming from proteins, they had reduced risk for overall mortality, cancer, and potentially diabetes. And the reason for potentially diabetes is that the number of deaths caused by diabetes were very small. And so we did not have strong conclusions about diabetes, but certainly the trend or the statistically it was reduced diabetes. And in fact, diabetes, from what I remember, was the only disease that was reduced both in the 65 and younger and 65 and older population that had low levels of protein intake. But we need to do more. But I believe now there are several studies that are supportive of this, of our conclusion, so that high protein intake seems to be associated, has been associated to increased diabetes by others.
And in another study, you analyzed data from the Nurses' Health Study and the Health Professionals Follow-Up Studies, and found that animal protein was associated with higher cardiovascular mortality, and plant protein was associated with lower all-cause mortality. Can you explain more about this study and why it's important?
Yeah, so there was a much larger study headed by Ed Giovannucci at Harvard. And and you know, it was motivated by us. I think I bugged Ed and got him to look at the database, which is over 100,000 people. And yes, you know, the result. Unfortunately, in that group, there was not the low protein intake group because most of the nurses and doctors that they follow don't have low protein diets. But you know, there was already a difference between moderate intake and high protein intake, and this was for all ages. But that effect went away when plant-based proteins were considered. Now, keep in mind that the reason in that group, there isn't really a high plant-based protein group, you know. So when the people that have a lot of plant-based protein in their diet tend to not eat a lot of proteins. It is possible that somebody could have a very high protein, plant-based protein intake. That could also be detrimental. So we don't know that, but certainly the high animal protein intake, particularly red meat, etc., that was associated with increased mortality.
You know, it's funny, actually, in the world of diabetes, there's many health professionals who, you know, will tell people living with diabetes, whether they're type 1 or type 2, to eat more protein because protein stabilizes blood glucose. And so, you know, people with diabetes can kind of hear this over and over and over again, and they gravitate towards eating more protein-rich foods. And I think in the long term, like you're suggesting, that actually might be worsening their overall health.
Yes. I mean, obviously, you always need more data, and I don't think there are definitive answers. But I think if you put it all together, and together, for example, with the other studies that I mentioned done by others, and also with our own studies of both mice and humans that lack the growth hormone receptor. Now, high protein diet means high activity of the growth hormone and IGF-1. And so essentially these genetic mutations are the equivalent, or certainly would mimic a very low protein diet. And both in mice and humans, we see high protection from diabetes in this when they have these protein response gene mutations. So I think if you put it all together, it will suggest that having a low protein diet is probably good. And also, I think later we're going to talk about the fasting mimicking diet, and the fasting mimicking diet, of course, is a low protein diet, and this seems to stimulate the generation of pancreatic cells. Now, this is done in mice, but certainly we have a hope that at least some of it will also work in people.
What exactly is the fasting mimicking diet, and what results have you observed using this diet with type 1 and type 2 diabetes?
Yeah, so the fasting mimicking diet was something that we developed with the help of the National Cancer Institute and the National Institute on Aging. And the reason for this was we were first doing fasting trials, clinical trials with fasting and cancer patients. And this was water-only fasting, and patients did not want to do water-only fasting. And so then with these funds from the government, we basically were able to develop a diet that was as effective as water-only fasting. It's a low protein, low sugar, high good fats, and diet. But there's all kinds of other tricks in it that have the scope basically of fooling the system into believing it's fasting completely. So that's what a fasting mimicking diet is.
Very cool. So I remember back when I was doing my PhD, I did a lot of reading about beta cell neogenesis. And for those of us, who don't know what that is, it's basically the synthesis of new beta cells from stem cell precursors. And a lot of the literature in this world of beta cell neogenesis says that, it doesn't really occur to a significant extent in adulthood. So your research on fasting mimicking diets actually indicates that fasting itself can stimulate beta cell neogenesis. So can you tell us a little bit about whether that's true and why that could be the case?
Yes, so in mice, we had shown that this is probably true for multiple systems, not just the pancreas. So we had first started with the hematopoietic system and showed that the cycles, the combination of fasting and refeeding would activate stem cell in the bone marrow, and then when the refeeding occurs, the stem cell would generate new blood cells. And so we did all kinds of other diseases and systems, and finally this year we got around to publish on diabetes, both type 2 and type 1 diabetes. And in type 2, we saw insulin sensitization. And in both type 1 and type 2 diabetes, we saw increased insulin production once the mice had deficiency in insulin generation. And the idea is that the starvation basically shrinks organs for the sake of energy saving, and then the organs and systems stand by and wait until food comes around at high levels, particularly proteins and sugars. And when that occurs, then these stem cells and progenitor cells, etc., go to work, and they can produce functional cells. Now, in the case of type 1 diabetes, we almost completely destroyed the pancreas to the point where it wasn't generating any insulin anymore, and the mice were hyperglycemic, severely hyperglycemic, would die from it. And then we started the cycles of the fasting mimicking diet, and that they was able to bring the insulin production back to normal permanently, in fact.
Okay, so you talked about doing several cycles in the mice. So how many cycles are necessary to do the fasting mimicking diet in order to get this secretion of insulin back to normal in humans?
We don't know. And of course, in humans, is the treatment is dangerous. Of course, we will do clinical trials, and we're starting to think about clinical trials, but people should not do it at home unless there's an endocrinologist that is following them and they understand all the risks involved. For example, one of the ways that you could die by fasting is fasting while you and then inject yourself with insulin, and that's a very bad recipe, because now you have insulin sensitization occurring due to the fasting. When you inject insulin, this can cause hypoglycemia, and the patient can even die. So just to scare a little bit people to not think that this can just be done easily at home in the absence of a group of specialists. So how many times does it need to be done? Well, in the clinical trials, both type 1 and type 2 diabetes, I think the original observation is once a month for 6 months for the initial study. And then we monitor and see what happened after 6 months, and 6 cycles of these, say 5 days on the diet, 25 days on the normal diet.
Got it. Okay, so going back to what you were saying earlier, you I think had alluded to autoimmunity in general as being aided by a fasting mimicking diet. So your research suggests that fasting mimicking diets can actually reprogram your immune system so that you can limit the severity of an existing autoimmune condition and potentially even reverse the symptoms of autoimmunity. So can you go into a little bit of detail here about how the fasting mimicking diet actually helps your immune system function and how that relates specifically to the reversal of autoimmunity?
So I always talk about, for example, when you cut yourself, right? So when you cut yourself, the system goes to work, and it recognizes the damage, and it can get rid of damaged cells, turn on stem cells, replace the damaged cells with good cells. And after a couple of months, you can even see what happened to your skin, right? And knowing that happens, I started thinking this must also happen inside the body, right? Not just on the outside. Why will it only happen on the outside? So there's an internal damage. This may also occur. So it looks like fasting and fasting mimicking diet are able to do that, to recognize damaged cells and distinguish them from non-damaged cells. And so during the starvation period, that is the period where you start killing cells and getting rid of autoimmune cells, in this case, in the case of multiple sclerosis. And then the stem cells are ready to go. And of course, when you refeed, you're not going to generate new autoimmune cells. You're going to generate non-autoimmune cells. And in the mice, we saw that about 20% or so of the mice that had symptoms of multiple sclerosis using this encephalomyelitis autoimmune model, about 20% went back to normal, and about 50% improved dramatically. But in general, all mice that had the MS symptoms improved. So we think that this can, again, recognize damaged autoimmune cells, get rid of them, and then replace them with more functional normal cells.
So with the exception of MS and type 1 diabetes, have you seen improvements in things like celiac disease or hypothyroidism or Crohn's disease or any other autoimmune conditions?
We're working on that, and we'll see what happens. But we believe it's probably has to do much more with autoimmunity in general than with specific disease. So yes, I think we would be disappointed if we didn't see it in more autoimmune disorders, but we have to wait and see. And now we also had in multiple sclerosis, we had a pilot clinical trial with 60 patients, of which 45 finished the trial. And in just one cycle of 1 week long fasting mimicking diet together with a follow-up of a Mediterranean diet, that was enough to, at least in the looking at quality of life and the opinion of patients, it was enough to improve their quality of life. Now, we will soon in Europe start a multi-center trial on multiple sclerosis using a 1 week long fasting mimicking diet every 2 months. And we'll see what happens, but certainly the mouse and preliminary data are promising.
Okay, so I'm sure our listeners are very intrigued by the fasting mimicking diet by this point. So if they would like to try it, you have a company called Prolon who you provide meal kits. So can you tell us about that?
Yes. So if somebody orders the Prolon kit, if they have any disease, they will have to have a doctor recommending it, and again, I don't know if the company can provide it. But let's say somebody healthy, or they might start having some pre-disease problems, have risk factors for diseases. They could order the kit, and then they talk to a nutritionist. And the nutritionist's job is to just explain how the kit is done. But basically, it contains 5 boxes, 1 per day, and for 5 days. And they consume the contents of each box each day. And then they have a transition diet for a day or so on day 6. And then they go back to whatever it is that they normally eat, And on average, normal people do it once every 4 months. And also, I like to point out, I think the kit now is around $220. I'm fighting hard to try to lower the price, but something that people have to also keep in mind that most people don't is that the average middle-class American spends about $150, $160 for food, drinks, etc. in 5 days. So the difference is actually about $60 in what you will normally spend in 5 days and what you spend if you're on the fasting mimicking diet, because of course you can't touch anything else other than what comes in the box, right? So I think it's a minimal difference, particularly if somebody does it 3 times a year per year, and I encourage people to. And also, I should say that most of it at least the majority of the profits, at least right now, will go to a foundation that will sponsor trials like this. So I think those are all reasons for trying to go that way.
Okay, so tell us about you. Do you do the fasting mimicking diet yourself?
Yes, so I do it around twice a year normally. Yeah, so a couple of times a year.
Let's talk about the future of type 1 diabetes, because over the course of time, and especially now, there's a lot of research efforts to try and find ways to restore insulin production. And there's many different approaches to finding a solution to type 1 diabetes. What do you see as the next 10 to 20 years of type 1 diabetes research? Are we, as a collection of scientists, ever going to get to a point where type 1 diabetes no longer exists, or that it can be easily treated and potentially even fully reversed?
Yeah, I'm going to speculate here. I think eventually, not too far in the future, it's going to be a device that does the trick. And at least for the pancreas, not for other organs, but for the pancreas, I think is a good choice for a device that detects glucose level and releases insulin. But until then, I think that the fasting mimicking diet have a real potential, especially because they start something that is natural. I mean, they start the ability. So if you look at the paper that we published on the fasting mimicking diet and the pancreas, you see that while they're on the diet, the genes that are activated are similar to the genes that are only seen at that activity during embryonic development and fetal development. And you see many genes, not just one or two. And so this is really suggesting that, it may not be as easy in people as it was in mice. Maybe what happens if somebody had diabetes for 20 years? We don't know, but certainly that ability to turn on the program that built the organ in the first place, it's really powerful. And I think it's also essential because, there are hundreds and hundreds of genes involved and cytokines, et cetera, et cetera. And so to reproduce this very complex world, I think it's going to be difficult, particularly if you cannot afford to have side effects. And, so this is why I like the future, the robotics way in the future. But for now, I really like the fasting mimicking diet. And now we're starting to consider what happens if you combine it with stem cell treatments, et cetera. Can we make it better or much better by doing combination therapy? So like we're doing for cancer, now we almost don't do fasting mimicking diet alone anymore. We do it together with standard of care drugs. And I wouldn't be surprised for type 1 and type 2 diabetes, but particularly type 1 diabetes, that we would combine it with some interventions that are promising independently of the fasting.
I know it's a little off topic, but I know when I'm with a profound researcher like you, I'm always curious to get your opinion. Do you have any theories on what is the cause of type 1 diabetes?
Well, I mean, I think that the accepted mechanism is autoimmunity. Now, if you're asking what triggers the autoimmunity, well, I think, it could be many different things. It could be combination. I wouldn't be surprised if drugs are involved. I wouldn't be surprised if antibiotics are involved. I wouldn't be surprised if microbiota is involved, right? So, now we're exposed to all these drugs. I wouldn't be surprised if in the book, I talk about one of the rules is stick with identify the genes, the ingredients that are good for longevity, but go pick the ones that your grandparents also consume, right? So don't do what your grandparents did, but look at the ingredients I'm describing and then go find in that category whatever your grandparents consumed. And so this is very important. For example, we know about gluten, and autoimmunities against gluten. I mean, these were not around because the consumption of gluten was much lower. Now you start consuming much higher levels of gluten, and all of a sudden the body recognizes that as foreign. Then you do that and maybe are treating the patients often, including kids, with antibiotics. And we know that the microbiome and the microbiota are very, very important in filtering things out and certainly modulating the immune system. And so you see now it's a recipe for disaster. This is why I also talk about in the book the fact that autoimmunities are going up about 15% a year, so which is extraordinary around the world. Now, some of it could be better diagnosis, but certainly some of it is not. And gluten autoimmunity is a very good example of something that seems to be exploding everywhere. So so I think that that'd be good to pay more attention to these kind of things, because small changes like taking antibiotics when necessary, and avoiding foods that we always love to talk about, quinoa and curcumin, and there is I make fun of this in my book, and I say you could, most of these things you can use whatever you always had around and do almost as good as that. There is no need to go pick up foreign. And not only there is no need, but does a lot of damage to the people in South America that make quinoa and then now are out of their major food. So this is not only good for your health to avoid these things, it's also good for the planet, because these fashions tend to do a lot of ecological damage.
Dr. Longo, thank you so much for being here with us today. There's, in the world of, evidence-based research here, when it comes specifically to, understanding the effect of high-protein diets and type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular mortality, I've read a lot of your work. And from the first time that I read your papers, I don't even know, 4 or 5 years ago, I was like somehow very drawn to your research. And I think you have more publications in cell science, nature, cell metabolism than anybody that I know. And so I'm actually I'm honored to be talking to you, and I totally appreciate the time that you took to talk with us today.
Well, thank you very much. You're very welcome. And, I think the challenge is, let's see what we can do with all this. And I think publications are just there for the purpose of solving problems. Let's see if we can solve some problems. Yeah.
And before we go, can you tell our listeners why they should buy your book?
Well, they should buy the book because I really, I spent 25 years working on this book, really, and really on one side is my journey to trying to figure out how to make people live long and healthy lives. So half of the book is about everyday diet, and the other half is about the fasting making diet and how it can be used to treat diabetes, prevent and treat diabetes, neurodegenerative diseases, cancer, and the cardiovascular disease and autoimmune diseases. So, and I go in details. I include a lot of citations. I didn't want to make this about opinion. There's very little opinion in the book. And I also talk about 5 pillars. I really am annoyed by all these books, most of them written by people that have very little preparation in this field, and they are doing tremendous damage. And so I think it's good, like in all fields, all other fields, where you let the experts talk about things, and so that's the reason to buy the book. And the last one, I think I don't make a penny out of the book either, and all of it goes back to the foundation called Create Cures Foundation. And the idea of this foundation that I started a few years ago is to fund creative research, so research that where scientists think differently, and many times this thinking different approach can solve problems that seem to be unsolvable. And also the focus of the foundation is now. What do you do? I know that both of you have diabetes. And our approach has always been both in the lab and in the foundation is, what do you do for somebody that has the problem right now? You know, we're all working. So many people are working on in 20 years, I'll do that. In 30 years, I'll do that. But what about people tomorrow? They go to the doctor, they get diagnosed with type 1 or type 2 diabetes. You know, what can they do now in addition to the standard of care? And it's incredible how little help there is. I mean, real help. I don't mean internet bad solutions, but I mean really solid data and things that patients in a careful way, together with the help of their doctor, can do. So that's what the foundation is about.